And, oh, by the way, Lieutenant Lee, who I talked about earlier, the real by-the-book guy, he actually got wounded. And when he got wounded, taken to the hospital, he went absent without leave, AWOL. He went AWOL from the hospital to get back to the line.
Oh, dang.
Yeah. He's oh, no, I'm fine. My arm, can't move it. It's in a sling. Doesn't matter. I'm going to fight. And speaking of Lee, talking about Lee's platoon here, when they weren't on patrol, Lee put his men through a rigorous training program of small unit tactics. They maneuvered all over the nearby hills, and they bitched at some extra work. Lee paid little heed to the grumbling. Soon we will meet the enemy, he predicted to his men. We will be ready. So Lee is a hard ass, and his guys, everyone else is doing, they're moving up north, and it was an easy day of patrol because remember the Chinese aren't pushing hard against them right now. So what does he do at night? Oh, guys, we're going to go do some work. We're going to do some tactical drills. Back to the book. It was an article of faith with Lee that combat leadership came from the front. In the attack, he positioned himself with the most advanced squad just behind the point. He wore a bright fluorescent pink vest fashioned of cloth panels that he obtained from the tactical air team. The intended purpose of the brilliantly colored panels was to mark the forward extent of our lines for supporting aircraft. Lee wore his vest so that his men could locate him quickly during a firefight. He still had a sling on his wounded right arm, and he carried his carbine in his left hand. He fired from the hip, using it to shoot tracers that marked sectors. So Lee is just, a whole nother level. Whole nother level. Chu-In Lee. That's his full name. Chu-In Lee. Now we get into a situation. The Chinese were dug in above Lee. They had a machine gun and a line of rifles more formidable than their usual defensive formations. They were expertly deployed below the crest, and their automatic weapons fired short, disciplined bursts. Tracers streaked, and bullets and shrapnel swept down the slope. It took Lee some time to locate the machine gun that was giving the most trouble. When he found it, he fired one-handed to put a tracer on it. His squads moved into skirmish lines, and the NCOs sent their own tracers to mark for their sectors. The bar and rifles followed, sending a great volume of fire up the slope at the Chinese. Wingett waved to me to let me know the mortar was ready. I aimed a tracer toward the machine gun and pumped my arm 4 times, the signal for 400 yards. I saw a round leave the tube and followed its path. It disappeared over the ridgeline. Wingett realized that he was too long, and without need for my correction, he came up a turn. So he's adjusting where the mortar round's hitting on his own. His second round was close, and I waved him to fire for effect. We seldom wasted ammo bracketing a target. Ammo carried up the hills was too valuable to be wasted on the niceties. The enemy guns slackened as Wingett pounded them. Lee's squad moved upward, responding to the NCO signals with short bounds. Fire team by fire team, 5-10 yards at a dash, then to ground, bearing fire on the enemy as the next fire team went in closer. Cover and move. It's happening again. The mortars are covering for him, and then each individual fire team is covering for each other. It was the classic Marine rifle tactic that Lee had drilled into his platoon during his extra training sessions. A Marine went down and writhed on the ground. The platoon's corpsman, Bill Davis, dashed low across the slope and crouched at the wounded man's side. Another Marine fell and didn't move again. His buddy stabbed the dead man's rifle into the earth by its bayonet, then continued forward. The Chinese found it difficult to defend against Lee's energetic tactics. Our coordinated mortar and machine gun fire kept them pinned to the ground. They were no longer able to apply aimed fire, and their effectiveness diminished as our riflemen pushed closer in on them. Cover and move. By the way, there's a reason why when I wrote down the 4 laws of combat, the number 1 rule is cover and move. This is why. Lee sent a squad crawling forward into grenade range. I signaled to Wingett to cease fire, and the mortar stopped exploding along the forward crest of the hill. The Chinese soldiers heaved a barrage of their potato masher concussion grenades down the slope. The Marines threw a responding volley. Our grenades were more powerful, filling the air with bits of hot flying steel. Both sides dove for holes. Another volley was thrown. Lee ran forward, waving the carbine over his head and calling for his Marines to follow. They surged for the top, screaming their gung-ho and rebel yells. The Chinese withdrew. They pulled their wounded away but left their dead on the slope. Lee pushed his men over the ridgeline where they prepared to defend against a counterattack. Lupacini stood beside Lee, his bar at the ready. Lupacini had appointed himself Lee's bodyguard. Sergeant Bondurant, the platoon guide, rifled through the pockets of the dead Chinese, gathering material for our intelligence people. I sent Kelly for a detail of the ammo carriers to bear the casualties. Bill Davis had 2 wounded men doped up with morphine and out of pain. And there was 1 Marine dead, already covered by his poncho. When he was certain that the Chinese would not counterattack, Lee ordered us off the hill. End of patrol. On the return march to the company perimeter, no one complained about Lieutenant Lee's excessive training methods. He walked along the column and thanked the men for their good work. I wondered to myself how many firefights Lee would survive standing at the front of his troops, clad in that brilliant pink vest. So, the excessive training, everyone's complaining when they're training, and then you get into a firefight and everyone's thankful that they had good disciplined leadership. A little bit more of Lee now at this point. Again, they're continuing to get pressed by the Chinese. Back to the book. More Chinese fire had broken out far to our right, in front of Lee's line. They fired from a sharp, short hill that rose from the meadow. Lee wheeled one of his rifle squads to face the rise and maneuvered them forward. Burris's gun was with Lee, and he traversed the face of the hill with HEs before the squad moved up. So HEs is high explosive mortars, and Burris is one of the mortarmen, and he's covering for the movement of Lee as they're pushing up. The Chinese ceased fire and withdrew quickly, a familiar tactic. Lee stayed with the main body of his platoon and sent a fire team up to reconnoiter the top. When they reached the top of the rise, the 4 men walked along the ridge in search of the vanished enemy. Looking up, Lee saw his men silhouetted against the skyline and yelled for them to get down. They were perfectly outlined targets. The Chinese saw them too, and already had the ridgeline registered for their mortars. Their first rounds blew a Marine to pieces. The next barrage claimed 2 more. The 4th man dove from the ridge and leaped, rolled, and stumbled down the hill. He came to a halt at the feet of Lieutenant Lee. Lee had seen 3 of his men needlessly killed, and he stood in silent fury. His good hand gripped his carbine so tight that his knuckles went white. "Stupid!" he hissed through his clenched teeth. "Stupid! Stupid!" over and over again. "Stupid!" He turned to Gene O'Brien, his platoon sergeant. "See to it that this never happens again, Sergeant. You tell the men, if I see another Marine on the skyline, I will shoot him myself." Lieutenant Lee strode off to be by himself until his fury and frustration subsided. So, you got guys making big mistakes, and for those of you that don't understand what happened, when you stand up on a ridgeline, you're completely obvious. It's very clear. And Lee's watching this happen and sees that his guys are a ripe target. He's yelling at him, but it's too late, and the mortars hit.